Good afternoon. This is Jeremy Mark. We're continuing our program today with an in-depth look at the housing market and its impact on economies in advanced economies. This was the topic of a chapter in the World Economic Outlook, which was released 2 days ago. And it's a chapter that's gotten somewhat less attention than other parts, which tended to look at the big picture of the global economy, medium-term outlook, and things like that. But it's a very important topic, obviously, given how central housing is to so many economies in the world. And to delve into this, we have our own housing expert today. I'd like to introduce Prakash Loungani, who is Director and Senior Lecturer at Johns Hopkins University's program in Applied Economics. Prakash previously was a senior IMF official, where he worked for many years in the research department, including on housing, and was also an important official in the IMF's independent evaluation office. But today he's here with his housing hat on, and thought we'd take a look. Prakash, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. It's good to be back.
So tell me, what is your broad take on this housing chapter in the World Economic Outlook?
So, it's definitely a useful chapter. I mean, as you said, housing is a pretty important part of the economy. So, it's kind of obvious that the IMF decided to tackle this question. I think both you and I, from our years at the IMF, know that there's an internal selection process for topics. There's people scout and ask for ideas, and there's a bit of a voting process. And it doesn't surprise me that housing ended up being one of the top vote getters.
Let's take that a little further. You said it's obvious. Why is it obvious that it would be chosen?
Well, the thing is that if you think of, if gas prices go up or if food prices go up, you think there would be a chapter in the wheel on what the impact is on people. So when interest rates go up, that's like a price. For homeowners, that just raises the cost of your mortgage payments. So, it's no different from those other prices going up. So it makes sense that, homes, which are such a big part of people's assets, for most of us, buying and selling homes, it's like the biggest purchase we're ever going to make in our lives. And so when interest rates go up, and as a result, mortgage rates go up, that's going to have a huge impact on our lives. And so I think it's both obvious but sensible for the IMF to kind of see, how are people coping with this change? So the title of the chapter is Feeling the Pinch. So basically they're trying to say, when interest rates go up, who feels the pinch? When gas prices go up and food prices go up, it's kind of, who's feeling the pinch. When interest rates go up, who feels the pinch?
So what did they find, do you think?
Well, I don't want to be uncharitable, but they found that the answer is it's complicated, which is not surprising. And we can get into the weeds later if there is time, but there were broadly two reasons why they found that the answer is complicated. One is that, unlike gas prices and food prices going up, which I did indeed use myself as motivation, when interest rates go up, the way that impacts families is a little more complicated. So one immediate channel is what they call the cash flow effect, which is that if interest rates go up, mortgage interest payments will likely go up and households will start to feel the pinch. But why is that complicated? It's because some people have long-term mortgages, and so they may not feel the pinch immediately. Other people may be first-time home buyers. They were just venturing out into the home market, and suddenly they see interest rates going up. They're going to feel the pinch immediately. So one reason is that these cash flow channels and other channels make it difficult to work out what the impact would be. And then the second reason that it's complicated is that different countries are quite different in the structure of their housing markets. Some countries like the United States have, a large fraction of mortgages being fixed rate mortgages. Other countries like the UK have more adjustable rate mortgages. So, when you put together the channels, and there were 7 different channels that the IMF talked about, and 5 different,
So these are the weeds you were talking
yeah,
about.
and
Okay.
the 5 different characteristics of countries, you end up with a matrix that is, quite impossible to navigate other than for academic economists. So
Right.
they ended up saying, look, it kind of depends. It depends on which country and which channel is operative.
Okay. So this is sort of uh, the the skeptical question, I guess you could say. Is there a value to this sort of analysis? Because it sounds like it goes over a lot of familiar ground. It doesn't sound like it was earth-shaking in its findings.
Yeah, yeah. I think again, I don't want to be uncharitable because having worked on these studies, I know how much work it takes even to get to this point. So I think that's right. I found it useful as somebody who's been following housing markets for a couple of decades. Um, Even though I knew the channels and I knew some of the differences across countries, just having it laid out, in one systematic way was useful. I teach real estate economics, so I've already taught this chapter to my students, and
Okay.
it's going to be
Okay.
a fixture on my reading list. So it's definitely, it pulls together a lot of information. It pulls together the information on the channels and so it's definitely useful for I would say researchers like myself and academics.
Okay, but the World Economic Outlook, strictly speaking, is not an academic exercise.
Sure.
It's supposed to be, if not a policy tool, at least something that can assist policymakers who are what indeed, is the raison d'etre for the IMF. So from that point of view, do you think the chapter would be useful to policymakers?
I don't think it would tell a policymaker in a particular country something they didn't already know about their own country. So if I was from Brazil, I don't think that this will give me some eye-opening insight about the Brazilian housing sector. What it would tell me is, how is Brazil situated relative to other economies? It would tell me, oh, this problem that I thought was a Brazil-specific problem is actually, shared by other problems. And so when I'm looking for solutions, I may say, well, this isn't Brazil-specific. I need to think broadly and think about, what solutions have worked in other countries. So in that sense, it is always, I think, useful for a policymaker to get this kind of broad cross-country perspective. But I think you're right. Would I insist that this be on the top of the reading pile of a policymaker? Perhaps not, because as I said, they know what's going on in their own country. When they have time, they can look at how things are shaping up in other countries. It gives them some pointers as to policies that have worked or not. But yeah, it didn't make a kind of earth-shattering policy contribution at this point, because the results, as I said, are kind of mixed and a bit all over the place.
Oh, and presumably it can be built upon in other research that the fund does in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a very useful piece of work, so I don't want to detract from that. Um, the thing is that, in academia, the way you get famous and published is by emphasizing the novelty of your work and emphasizing that you found some very strong conclusions in one direction or the other. To me, kind of the value of the IMF's research is actually that the IMF is not under the same pressure. The IMF can publish a chapter of the kind they did, which is to say, look, here are the channels, here are the way in which countries differ. If you put it all together, it's very difficult to say, this country is going to get affected or that country is going to get affected. And they did an honest job of summarizing what differences they found. So I think this kind of study would not get published in academia, but it's useful for the IMF to say, look, this is what the truth tells you.
Here's a spotlight, right. Yeah. Okay, tomorrow there's a change in leadership in the research department, the IMF, and you were named the head of the economic counselor of the IMF.
My dream, yeah.
Yeah, right. Wait. So you are in a position to determine what's going to be in OEO. Let's say you want to take a different look at housing. What would you see as a useful analysis to delve into at this point for policymakers, for others, when discussing housing markets on a global level?
Okay, so let me try to answer that on two levels. First, kind of continuing a bit on the nerdy level of on the chapters of this theme. There were a few things missing from this chapter that if I had been the head of the research department, I would have asked the staff about. One is kind of demographics. Demographics play a huge role in driving housing markets. How many new families are coming onto the market? Those are the ones who really have a strong demand for housing. The rest of us can kind of postpone our demand. You and I at our stage in life can stay on in our present houses. We can postpone buying the second house or the retirement house.
Or the retirement community.
The retirement community. But, it's the new households that are coming on to the market who have decided they're going to have a family. They are the ones who are desperately trying to become homeowners. So in each economy, the structure of demographics, what fraction of the population is kind of going to be new home owners is critical. And so I think that was not studied in this chapter, which to me was a bit puzzling. They didn't really explain why they didn't do that. The second one, which they did explain, was they focus mostly on homeowners, but a large fraction of the population in many countries is people who are just renting, either homes or apartments, and they said for data limitations, they didn't look into that at all. And to me, that's a big omission, because what we are learning is more and more that homeowners still have some kind of cushion that sees them through the impact of interest rates on housing markets. It's the renters who really have a huge cash flow impact, who are really at the margins where a high interest rate and the resultant increases in house prices and rents really affects them. So I think that's a huge chunk of the market that they didn't really look at. They have in other studies, but they didn't in this chapter. So I think that was an omission. So if I had been sitting there as head, I would have said, guys, why aren't we looking at this? But I think to go to your question a little kind of more centrally, to me, the question always has been, how does the IMF talk about problems in the housing sector? If the IMF reaches a judgment that house prices are really going up and for reasons that are not easy to explain. So it's not because of demand and supply fundamentals. It's happening because of exuberance, irrationality. For whatever reason, house prices are just going up for reasons that are difficult to explain, and therefore they are likely to collapse. How should the IMF talk about this? Should it go out in public and say, hey folks, prices in Slovenia are going to collapse next week? Or should it say, go privately to the Slovenian government and say, look guys, we think you have a big problem in your housing sector. So I think that's really where I see that even if I were the head of the research department, I would struggle, how should I go about this question? And we tackled it differently in my time when I was a grunt in the research department, and from how they're doing it now.
Okay. I, I'm going to I'm going to give you a different job now, which is the head of the Asia Pacific department. I thought it was interesting, um, another omission in the chapter, which was that the primary analysis was basically silent on the second largest economy in the world, China. Until about 2020, property in the broadest sense of how it interacts with economy was roughly 25 to 30% of GDP in China. And yet the chapter really did not get too much into the dynamics or how those dynamics fit by comparison with other economies. I've wondered if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that too. I mean, I noticed that at the end of the chapter there was what is called a box, a little few paragraphs set out that were on China. I wondered about that too, but I was digging a bit, and in fairness to them, the IMF had just completed what's called an Article 4 report, their country report. I remember when I was in the communication department, I fought a losing battle to say, why don't we call the Article 4 report a country report? So
Yeah,
everybody
right,
would
right.
know what it is, but you and I were both in that department, we know those struggles. But so in fairness, they had released a country document, I think just in February, that was a very detailed look at the Chinese property sector. And so they did do their analysis, they did do their homework, and perhaps they felt that repeating it in the VO was not needed. But I think it goes back to what I was saying, do you kind of yell fire in a crowded theater? I mean, China is too big to fail. Do you really want to go out in public and express whatever views you may have? I mean, going back to what I was saying, in 2008, when I was working on the housing markets in the VO, we actually publicly said at the time, again, I want to make clear, I'm not saying anything about housing markets right now. At the time, we said that the Netherlands market and the Australian market were 20 to 30% overvalued. And we said this publicly in the VO. And that evoked a very furious reaction from these people who said, what do you guys know about housing markets? And Australian housing market blogs said, what does this guy Prakash Loungani know about housing markets in Sydney? Why is he telling us housing markets are 20% overvalued? And so, so I think after that, the IMF kind of backed off and said, yes, we will conduct internal exercises and periodically report the results of those exercises in the VO in the form of heat maps that just say, oh, we think this is somewhat overvalued, this is maybe fair price, this is undervalued. But we won't go out and shriek in public that housing markets are overvalued or due for a correction. So I think when it comes to China, they're faced with a similar situation. They can do very deep analysis, but at the end of the day, they have to be very guarded in what they say. But I'm actually curious about I know you're interviewing me, but I'm curious about your views on China, because when it comes to China, I think you could say more about Chinese housing markets in Chinese than I could say in English.
Well, I think you're very kind, and you're also very exaggerating. But seriously, look, I think that I read through that box. As I said, I saw the absence of China from the main chapter. Excuse me. I read through that box, and they seemed to basically be focusing on how China had been responding to the collapse that occurred between 2020 and 2023, and it is ongoing in the property market. And I think that it was a bit incongruent with the analysis, because it basically was the equivalent to analyzing the design of the barn door after the horse has already fled into the field, right? So it was awkward. But I think also what was going on was that what brought about China's collapse was a series of political decisions that it's very awkward for the IMF to analyze. You know, essentially what happened, it was late 2020, China imposed were called the three red line criteria
Right, I
on
remember that.
developers, right?
Yeah.
Where they essentially forced deleveraging by way over indebted, overextended developers involving liability to asset ratios, net gearing, cash on hand versus short-term debt. And the end result was it pulled the rug out from under the market. And I think it's very hard for the fund sometimes to write about these kinds of things when they go wrong in a place like China, a powerful, big country that's very sensitive to criticism. Because essentially, you know, the fund had been gently calling on China for several years to be very careful about using, in essence, housing policy as a key part of its effort to boost its growth rate, particularly after the global financial crisis. But the reality was that the three red lines were the monetary policy equivalent of opening a walnut with a sledgehammer, and China was paying the price. So what I think you need to do is see that when they were writing this chapter, China was facing widespread property developer defaults, mortgage boycotts, the loss of consumer confidence, and a black eye for Xi Jinping. So what they've done, in essence here, but also in chapter 1 of the WIO, looking at the primary global trends, what they've done is they are telling China, you got to get the property developers stable again, you got to restore consumer confidence, and then the chapter itself avoided dealing with some of these other issues. We got about 3-4 minutes left. I'm curious if there are other things in the WIO beyond the housing chapter that you thought were particularly interesting.
I think the WIO kind of, had a good coherent theme, because, I mean, as we were discussing, the housing issues were mostly about the advanced economies, and there was a real fear last year that there would be a hard landing, and trying to avoid a hard landing in the advanced economies was on everyone's mind, and it seems like we have avoided that. Some people say it'll come this year, we don't know, but at least last year we avoided a hard landing, and I think this chapter, the one we were talking about, says, that happened partly because housing markets showed resilience for some of the factors that we discussed. And so then the rest of the WIO says, well, it seems like we've avoided a short-term calamity, and then it turns its attention to kind of longer-term issues. And so it has, I think, 2 very good chapters. And I think it's really, it hangs together well. There's a chapter on growth in both advanced and emerging economies, the role of TFP, I believe you covered that. And then the last chapter is interesting because it actually talks about how much emerging markets can affect advanced countries. And so this notion of spillbacks, I think, is going to become more and more important. We've operated on the belief that what's good for the US or for advanced economies is good for the world, that the spillbacks are limited. But I think the emerging markets, China, India, others, are getting to the point where what happens there matters for the advanced economies. And so this, I think, analyzing these spillbacks or reverse spillovers is really an important issue as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a good WIO, I think, that really tackled kind of topical things.
I agree with you. I think that the look at declining medium-term growth, in which they basically said that global growth is probably by 2030 likely to average around 2.8% a year versus 3.8% now, which is very significant in global terms. Had a lot of very interesting analysis behind it, and encourage viewers to find it. Also, yesterday We did a session at the Atlantic Council, which is now online, called Decoding the WEO, where we dove into some of those chapters as well. We didn't touch on housing at all, which is one of the reasons that we've done this session today, to kind of take a closer look at a topic that is very important to a lot of people out there. And we really appreciate, Prakash Loungani, that you've come and joined us today to
Thanks,
talk.
Jeremy. Yeah.
And hope we can have you back at another meeting. We can
Absolutely,
find
anytime.
something wonkish to dig into. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned, there's plenty more programming to come.